Good morning, Scott.
Welcome back to another edition of the what do we call this even?
I think it's called the bookcase, but the last email you sent me had a different, like it had a slightly different name to it. But it's been a while, really.
It
I
has.
kind of missed it.
I've missed it too. Is that because you've not been reading anything?
I was thinking the same thing. That is not the case.
Hmm.
I think I go in kind of some ups and downs, but definitely been trying to keep the eyes engaged with some books.
And as you know, I've moved, and so part of the reason that we haven't done one of these is because I've been packing up books rather than cracking books and reading them from cover to cover. But thankfully, we're back, and we have two new books. The first one is Jonathon Haidt's brand new book called The Anxious Generation, which is a book about rising rates of anxiety and depression among our nation's youth.
And our other book is called We Built Reality. It's a book, it's actually a short book by a political scientist named Jason Blakely, professor at Pepperdine University. He does have some relevance to one of our previous bookcases when we discussed some articles out of Harper's Magazine. He had written one about scientism and our response to the COVID pandemic.
Let's just start with each of the two books and kind of a brief summary, Dan, and I'll go first. I actually had to go to the bookstore to pick this up because surprise, surprise, it had a copy, but Amazon, I was on a wait list for it. And I understand that this book has been selling quite well. People familiar with Haidt's work know that he's written a number of popular books in the last decade and a half. The one that really got my attention first was The Righteous Mind, where he was looking at political divisions and trying to account for that especially in the United States. In The Anxious Generation, it's a massive book, well into 400 pages or so. And he's talking about the decline of what he calls synchronous play, meaning that children actually go outside and talk with each other, in favor of safetyism, parents being quite concerned about the risks of children being outside. And secondly, the limited believed risks there are for children spending time connecting with each other by a smartphone, not a mobile phone, not a phone that can text, but one that can access internet and use attention grabbing apps. And his book ties the rise of the smartphone and forward facing cameras. So you see all the selfies being taken by young people and posted on TikTok and Instagram and Snapchat and the rest in around 2010, and the deleterious impact he believes, and he cites a massive number of studies supporting the notion that this is what is responsible for declining rates of mental health amongst our nation's youth. Book's divided into four parts. That first part is where he documents declining mental health. Second part is where he talks about what kids really need to thrive. The third part is the problem that these mobile devices pose to kids. And then the last one is, well, what are we all supposed to do about this? What are kids, parents, governments, and of course, technology companies supposed to do about that? And I would say that it's worth a read. I would also say that Haidt's style from prior works is reflected in the current work. The writing is dense, it is repetitious, it can be citation heavy. You can get the gist of what he's saying by simply reading the introduction. If you really want the details and be able to cite stats, you can read it all the way from start to finish. For me, I thought that the weakest part and the part I'm most skeptical about is what we're supposed to do about this particular problem.
So I know I have to introduce this book, but I just feel like I just want to jump in
Yeah.
because I look at an example of somebody like you, Scott, who it seems to me spends a modest amount of time on social media, I think in particular Facebook. And I get the sense, I didn't hear you say it, but that it enriches your life because I've just, I notice on Facebook that you post questions and you in essence moderate some pretty interesting and I think fruitful discussions among people. Not to mention the ICCE Facebook page, which really has some fantastic little gems in there.
Yeah.
And so to call its effects on teenagers and even younger notwithstanding, it certainly can be very useful in connecting people with similar interests in a way that in-person contact just never could
Mm.
because of accessibility.
Well, I I certainly feel as though social media, the ability to connect instantaneously with people all over the world, is an a disruptive innovation on par with the printing press, and that we're just beginning to wrap our heads and around what the implications are, and policy is going to follow for it. We're still debating which book should be in public libraries, for example. That's a disruption that started 500 years ago. But I think Haidt's argument is more specific to a particular age. For girls between the ages of 11 and 13, and for boys between the ages of 13 and 15, when he believes there is a critical period where social media can have significant and deleterious effects. For girls, it's all about the social interaction, comparison with others, unfavorable body image, etc. For boys, it's distracting from risky play and from getting outside and being part of nature, and the social skills that result from resolving problems that occur when you are face to face with another person. I don't think he's making any argument about the limitation of these platforms for adults.
In my belief system, it's kind of like the cat is out of the bag. I realize that we need to do our best to kind of protect our vulnerable teens from bad influences. And at the same time, is it going to be entirely possible to keep a cell phone out of the hands of a 14 or 15-year-old girl? Teenagers explore things.
Mm,
That's
mm,
they're constantly looking for things to wire themselves to.
mm. Well, and in the last chapter, in Haidt's defense, he does give some suggestions. So, for example, he notes that it's very hard for parents to say no to their individual child when the counter argument from the kid is, well, everybody else has a cell phone. How do you do it? He said that he offered the example of a contract that only becomes enforceable after 10 parents sign on. That contract is that you will not have access to these apps and this type of phone. He's not against having a phone or a phone that's capable of texting. It's a phone with apps and instant access to the internet and everything that it has available. And the irony that we would put this in the hands of children because we perceive it to be safer than letting them go outside and potentially be abducted or run over by a car or fall down and hurt themselves, when he says that the harms are obvious. Another one is to limit this until kids are age 16 so that they have more agency and control. Otherwise, we end up with, as he points out, poor social skills for boys and this body distortion amongst girls. The foundational metaphor, surprisingly, about Jonathon Haidt, from Jonathon Haidt, is that we're rewiring the brain. And your book has something to say about all of these analogies or metaphors.
Yeah, so this book, it's a short book. It's very pithy. It's not an easy read, but the basic point is that there's been a conflation of the natural sciences with the social sciences, the sciences of human behavior, and that people take the social sciences as gospel, even though they're in essence stories that we construct, and that not only are these stories constructed, they actually influence our behavior. I can give an example. It talks about a concept called broken windows policing. And the concept was that the more that people saw that there were minor infractions going on, they'd be more likely to commit more serious infractions. And so it was important for police to crack down on the small infractions. So we all heard this, and this story made a lot of sense to us. And it came from the experts,
Yeah,
the
punish those
people that
lawbreakers.
study it. And so, hard on, I mean, we still hear that today.
Yeah.
We need to be hard on crime.
Yeah.
And so the issue that he raises in this book is that it particularly affected people of color and poorer neighborhoods. The crimes, the minor crimes that were cracked down on were more likely to occur in these poorer areas. And so it disproportionately affected those neighborhoods. And it eventually led to things like the brutal beating of Black people at the hands of police. It was a reality that was created with this initial spark of broken windows, and that there are really a number of social scientific ideas that trickle down to affect our behavior and our stories that we tell about ourselves.
And I know that you and I were talking before we turned on the recording about the broken windows policy and how the meaning was different in different neighborhoods. So that certain crimes, like maybe shoplifting from a Nordstrom's, was different from shoplifting from the bodega, or treated differently, which ended up having some people go the judicial system route and get involved and maybe institutionalized, etc., developing a record which followed in them for a long period of time. And things that I know I did. I was pulled over at age 16, having been at a party, and it just so happened that the person who pulled me over, and I shouldn't have been driving a car, was somebody who knew my family quite well. And this police officer did not take me to jail. In other words, did not enforce the broken windows policy. Instead, what he did was follow me home, rousted my father out of bed, and told him what had happened. And it really had a different impact on my life than had I been arrested, lost my license, maybe it interrupted my chance to get into college or university or even get a job.
I had a similar experience when I was quite a bit older than you, and I had two small children in the car. And I don't know how intoxicated I was, but the policeman sent me on my way, said, "Have a nice day."
And I know that for both of us, these experiences had profound effects, even though the police involved didn't follow the broken windows policy and arrest us both, and etc.
Yeah, and that experience for me, it led to, not long after that, I stopped drinking.
So social sciences are not like the natural sciences. They're not descriptions of things that exist in nature.
Absolutely.
They're not so much discovering as inventing categories. And Blakely not only makes this point with regard to broken windows, but even to things like dividing states into the red and the blue states. It masks with in-group variability. And in the process, makes the discussion more and more extreme.
That's absolutely right. He talks about the election statistics and that you're more likely to go watch the TV and see how much red and how much blue there is rather than talking to your neighbor about particular differences of opinion that you might have in a just a face-to-face give and take dialogue.
And so
And
I'm
that
I'm trying to instantly in the conversation, instead of listening to the other person, I'm trying to fit them into one of these invented categories, which then leads me to think, well, now I get you. No further conversation is necessary.
right. And we take these categories as if they are scientific facts rather than just stories that we're telling about each other that we probably should explore more deeply rather than accept as facts.
I think this is where the connection is between the two books, that if in fact these concepts in social science are inventities rather than discoveries of natural effects, that we have to be mindful of what we expose young brains to.
I think they're both very good reads. I think as long as you read any book with some healthy skepticism. Although I will say as I read this book, I was becoming outraged. I called both of my daughters who each have children and I'm like, don't give them a cell phone.
I'd agree. I think both books are worth a read. I would hate that the conclusion be that we should be more skeptical about what we read. I
Okay.
I think that we have a very literate population who know enough to think of counter arguments for everything. We saw this during the pandemic on both sides of the debate
Right.
about a number of topics.
Can you say a little bit more about taking issue with the skepticism?
Yeah, I think this highly literate generation that we have is deeply skeptical, typically, unless it comports with their
Right,
pre-existing beliefs.
right.
So I think it's about questioning and thinking of counterfactuals for things that we believe are true.
Okay.
And this is what I used social media for primarily during the pandemic. Not to reinforce what I already knew. And I'm frightened of the algorithms that are constantly feeding you a curated content designed to obviate the need to think about this, because I'm being told everything I already think and agree with, which gives me the sense of, well, Jesus, everybody believes this, and anybody who doesn't is an idiot.
Right.
And trying to think of counterfact. This is what I got from Blakely. It's what I get from science, frankly. It's what I get from postmodern and social deconstruction. It's always about questioning what I think I know for sure. What are the counterfactuals?
So maybe a healthy skepticism of your own beliefs
I think
rather
that,
than a skepticism of what's being presented to you.
yes, because
That
I
that
think
better.
that books and social media, we tend to pick those things. And now social media using AI actively feeds us things that we tend to agree with.